The Book of Mormon is a sacred record, but is the history contained within it true? Let's find out. Welcome to the first episode of Discovering the Book of Mormon through Science and Archaeology. We will start our search in Arabia, where I lived for 27 years. The first 8% of the Book of Mormon took place in Arabia. In later episodes, we'll turn our attention to the New World and the history of the Book of Mormon there. For now, we will start with a video Tim Sidor and I made some 20 years ago.
Book of Mormon scholars have long believed that Valley of Lemuel was located in the northwest corner of what is today Saudi Arabia. Among these scholars is Dr. Hugh Nibley, who states of this barren region, quote, "The desert into which Lehi first retreated, and in which he made his first long camp, has been known since Old Testament times as the wilderness par excellence. The particular waste in which Lehi made his first camp is among the most uninviting deserts on earth. Detestable certainly describes the place in the eyes of Lehi's people, who murmured bitterly at being led into such a hell." Unquote. But Nephi described a fertile valley with many fruits, grains, and a river of flowing water. After completing an exhaustive 44-year study of Saudi Arabia's water resources, United States Geological Survey and Saudi Arabian Department of Water Resources concluded, Saudi Arabia may be the world's largest country without any perennial rivers or streams. Where is the fertile Valley of Lemuel in a land described as hell? And where is its river of flowing water in riverless Arabia? From what George had read in the Book of Mormon, he reasoned that the Valley of Lemuel must be a mountain canyon. Nephi wrote that the valley was in the borders, which meant the mountains. The Arabic word for mountain is jebel, which conjugates in Hebrew as jebel, which means the borders. The mountains in northwest Arabia are called the Hijaz, that literally means in English the barriers or borders. Linguist Hugh Nibley noted that borders should be capitalized because that's what the area has been called, the Jebel, which means the borders. Nephi wrote that the valley was in the borders, meaning the valley was in the mountains. Since the Valley of Lemuel was in the mountains, it must have been a canyon. Webster's dictionary defines a canyon as a deep, narrow valley with steep sides, and often with a stream flowing through it. The classic definition of a canyon seems to match Nephi's description of the Valley of Lemuel. He wrote that his father pitched his tents near the Red Sea, next to the river, inside the valley. Yet at first his father did not initially realize that the river emptied into the Red Sea. The most logical explanation is that steep and narrow canyon walls prevented Lehi from seeing the Red Sea. Second, we knew that the valley had a small stream flowing continually through it. Nephi indicated that it was a river of water. Dr. Nibley clarified for us what this meant. Dr. Nibley notes, the expression river of water is used only for small local streams. The river of Laman must have been a small local stream, no name known to Lehi. It cannot, therefore, have been an important stream, let alone one of the most remarkable on earth, or Lehi would have known about it. Third, the Valley of Lemuel opened onto the fountain of the Red Sea. The footnote in the Book of Mormon suggests It was on the Gulf of Aqaba, which is in the Red Sea. Fourth, the Valley of Lemuel was very fertile. Nephi wrote that they gathered many kinds of fruits, seeds, and even grain. However, Saudi Ministry of Agriculture has classified all the lands near the shore of the Gulf of Aqaba as 0% arable due to poor soil and rocky conditions. Apparently, scientists do not know of any such place, but Nephi saw a river in a firm and steadfast and immovable valley and wrote about it. So, what instructions did Nephi give us for finding the Valley of Lemuel? He wrote that they traveled in the borders. If we replace the term borders with mountains, we read, "And he came down by the mountains near the shore of the Red Sea, and he traveled in the wilderness in the mountains which are nearer the Red Sea." Note that Nephi first wrote that they traveled by the mountains, and then in the mountains. The mountains they traveled in were the mountains nearer the Red Sea. Nephi indicates that the wilderness they traveled in had two mountain ranges, both near the Red Sea. Indeed, this is exactly what is found in Midian, where there is one mountain range near the Red Sea and one nearer the Red Sea, with mountains ascending to over 6,000 feet. The Valley of Lemuel was in the mountains nearer the Red Sea. Finally, Nephi wrote that they arrived at the river after traveling 3 days in the wilderness. In biblical times, the land known as the wilderness started near what is today the port of Aqaba at the northern end of the Gulf of Aqaba. Lehi could only have traveled in Arabia with tents and provisions if he had camels. A camel can travel between 20 and 25 miles per day, depending on load and terrain. This meant that their campsite by the river must have been somewhere between 60 and 75 miles from the northern end of the Gulf of Aqaba, and somewhere in the shoreline mountains. Does the trail Nephi described lead to a canyon with a stream? We were ready. The next morning we would follow Nephi's directions and see where they led us. As we traveled into Arabia, we found the terrain just as Nephi had described it, that they came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea. On our right were the waters of the Gulf of Aqaba of the Red Sea. Before us, excellent terrain for camels to travel, and on our immediate left were mountains. Nephi's initial instructions worked for about 45 miles. Then the passage along the shoreline ended. Here the mountains fall directly into the Red Sea. So what did Nephi say they did next? They traveled in the borders or mountains. We were not surprised then that the only wadi or valley into these mountains was found within a mile of where the mountains reach the sea. If we were on Lehi's trail, the prophet would have had only one choice: to enter this valley. But did this wadi lead to a river? We needed to see where this valley led, if anywhere. By the time we reached the end of the wadi, we were 6 miles east into the mountains and 3 miles south from where we left the shoreline. The wadi proved to be a passage through the mountains to a rise where it opened into another wadi that headed south. George knew the shoreline mountains of Midian as a giant maze of intertwined mountains. Yet, here before us was a U-shaped wadi that led straight through the shoreline mountains. We learned later that the name of this valley was the Wadi Tayyib al-Ism. We headed down through the wadi to see where it led. As we passed through the U-shaped saddleback that separated the mountain valleys, we noticed border markers that indicated that the Bedouins still used the mountains to define their tribal borders. We noticed three interesting characteristics of the Wadi Tayyib al-Ism. First, it had no exits. If Lehi entered this valley, he undoubtedly would have followed it to its end. Second, it provided an excellent footing for camels. Third, as we followed it down through the mountains, we were quickly coming to our limit of 75 miles, and what we were seeing was typical Midian landscape. No water, no vegetation to speak of, certainly no fruit trees or grain. We were starting to lose hope as our trip speedometer read 72 miles. We had driven almost the equivalent of a full 3 days camel ride, and still there was only rocky terrain. Rather than a fertile valley, all we saw was an occasional acacia tree barely hanging on to life. At this point, the wadi took a sudden turn to the west and headed for the tall shoreline mountains. Here, we expected the wadi to dead end. Instead, we found something Lehi would have been very grateful to have come upon: an oasis of date palms. The Arabs have a saying that the date palm has its feet in the water and its head in the fire. The fire referring to the very high temperatures needed to ripen dates, and the water referring to the abundant water that is needed for the palms. On seeing the palms, Lehi would have known that he had found a supply of water and food for his family. And how did we come upon this fertile valley? We followed exactly Nephi's instructions. In other words, using Nephi's directions, it is almost impossible not to find this oasis. However, the wadi did not end at the oasis. There is a great crack in the granite mountains that separates the oasis from the Red Sea, a canyon of pure granite. Within a few hundred yards of entering the canyon, we came to a true discovery, a springhead that fed a small desert river. Here was a stream of pure water flowing through a spectacular canyon formed from one of the hardest rocks on earth.
How do we know that the river flows all year round? I have visited the river 7 times, including the rainy season and in the driest part of summer, once after it hadn't rained for 14 months. What are the reasons or the facts that indicate to us that the river flows continually? First, we have the algae that grows along the river's banks. Second, the vegetation that grows along the stream. Third, the freshwater snails that live in this river. And what of the valley in which the river is found? It is made of solid granite, one of the hardest rocks on earth. This valley can only be described as firm, steadfast, and immovable.
Lehi's family gathered seeds and fruit of many kinds and also grain. Hundreds of date palms grace the canyon and the oasis in the upper valley. All 3 species of date palms are found in the valley. Delicious teen berries also grow in the canyon. Lehi's family could have collected other seeds and fruits and herbs in the valley. We found grain growing in the valley in 5 separate places. Is there any evidence that Lehi and his family stayed in this valley? Perhaps. On the north side of the oasis, just outside the canyon, is found the ruins of what appears to be a large permanent campsite. Lehi and his family stayed in the valley for months, perhaps even years. They certainly would have built windbreaks, storage areas, and tables and utility walls out of stone. Finding an antiquities site in the valley raised questions. Had archaeologists visited the site? What was it? And how old were these ruins? In search for the answers to these questions, George Potter traveled to King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals in Saudi Arabia. He knew that a team of international archaeologists had surveyed northwest Arabia in 1980. George's research led him to the archaeological collection of the main library. Volume 5 of the Journal of Saudi Arabian Archaeology had the information he needed. The ruins in the Wadi Tayyib al-Ism had been visited by the survey team in 1980. They had classified them as, quote, an encampment, end quote, and cataloged them as archaeological site number 200-81. The archaeologists reported that they found surface artifacts at site 200-81, including stone enclosures, stone monuments, and pottery shards. We also found pottery shards at the encampment and questioned their age. The archaeologists classified the pottery at site 200-81 as Iron Age Median and Hellenistic. They defined the Iron Age for this region as late 2nd to mid 1st millennium BC. We now knew that the campsite dated back to at least the time of Lehi. Nephi wrote that his father built an altar and gave thanks to God. Above the ruins of the campsite, Michael Bellerson from Germany and Sachinand from New Zealand discovered what they believe was a possible altar. Mike explains.
Very close to the campsite, and we found some mankind structures, and there's a possibility that this might be Lehi's altar. This being a high place would be a proper site of an altar. Lehi's altar would have been a large stack of uncut rocks like this one. These black rocks are not natural to find here on this hill, so somebody had to bring them up here. I found laying on the ground many pieces of broken pottery. I found it interesting because pottery was used to contain oil and scrolls for the altar ceremony.
We found other structures that could have been used as altars in the Wadi Tayab including this one on the south side of the wadi. One other man-made feature caught the eye of Richard Wellington from England: a small stone box buried in the floor of the canyon.
Documentation for our research can be found in our books on our website, christinperu.com. You can also get information there about our annual tours to Peru. Learn more about the Book of Mormon through science and archaeology by subscribing to this website. Thank you.